Good afternoon and welcome to the COMA UK conference. It's Thursday afternoon and you're in the Urban Micromobility session. My name is Matthew Clark. I'm from Steer. I'm also the chair of COMA UK. Just going to wait a few moments for a few more people to filter into the room and then we'll start our presentation. Thanks very much. Great, well, welcome everybody, and welcome to Thursday afternoon session on urban micromobility. Just to provide a little context for this topic, COVID-19 has prompted UK government to bring forward shared e-scooter trials. Since earlier in the year, more than 40 locations are now in the pipeline. Of those 40 locations in the pipeline, only 6 have more than 200 or more e-scooters, thanks to some stats from Oliver O'Brien. To put this in comparison, COMA's website lists just 19 bike share schemes in the UK in last year. There is substantial change happening in the market, with increased demand for trips, and also changes in public policy. So, what are we going to do in this session? I'd like to first define what is urban micromobility. Is it bikes? Absolutely. Yes, and bikes are legal here in the UK. Is it e-bikes? Absolutely. Yes, they're legal in the UK. Is it e-scooters? It is. Are they legal in the UK? Only in certain places at the moment. What about speed e-bikes? What about mono wheels? What about low-speed microcars? Are these part of micromobility? The question is not yet been answered. Some of these things are not yet legal, and the whole sector is changing quite quickly. So as part of this session, hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these questions and more, including how is shared micromobility working in towns and cities in the UK and internationally? And how can shared micromobility help to deliver societal and public policy goals? Before I go on, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support today. And we're going to introduce a series of speakers. Our speakers are joining us from across the world. Our first speaker is joining us from Tel Aviv. It's 5:30 p.m. in Tel Aviv. And with that, I'm just going to tee up his presentation. And I'm going to introduce Eyal Santo, who is Director of Bicycle and Micromobility Pilot Projects from the city of Tel Aviv. And
hello.
Here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, can I be heard?
Yes, you can, yes.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody from Tel Aviv. I am Eyal Santo. I'm a freelance urbanist, currently under contract for the Tel Aviv DOT, and I will be speaking about designing cities for micro mobility. And I will start by saying basically that I think, not just me, that urban mobility is killing us. Sorry, not urban mobility, but the urban planning, urban design. How so? If I take, for example, just a view from Atlanta, Georgia, and I allow myself to take a quote from Jeff Speck's book, The Walkable City. Take a look at this urban street, so-called, a 7-laner flanked by low income homes, no shade, no crosswalking for miles, no sidewalks. And here in this place in 1999, again, I lost the next, sorry. Dr. Richard Jackson was driving when he noticed an elderly woman in her 70s struggling with a couple of shopping bags in the heat of 35 degrees centigrade. And it struck him, what happens if that lady was hit by a heat stroke or hit by a car? Then what would the doctors say the cause of death is? And of course, they would say it's either heat stroke or a motorized vehicle trauma, but nobody will say it's a lack of shade, lame public transit, poor urban design, fraudulent political leadership, etc. And from this actually came up 5 years later, the first real study by 3 doctors, including Richard Jackson, connecting urban planning and health. And indeed, Health is one of the major issues with the urban challenges that we're facing these days. As you can see, mostly having to do with our sedentary lifestyle. But it's only part of the urban challenges that we face, such as congestion and traffic jams. Of course, pollution, air and noise, wasting too much land for car parking, for car traffic, and naturally sprawling and suburbanization, where we are always in an impossible pursuit of feeding the insatiable monster, because supply will never catch demand and the one will ever grow. So let's try to look at the big picture, and indeed, which kind of city do we want? The one on the right or the one on the left? So think about the day when our cities encourage us to leave our cars at home and go about our errands, school, work, etc., using bicycles and other active mobility, or the day when our employers will encourage us to leave the car at home and commute to work by active mobility, or the day when our cities encourage our local shops to switch from polluting delivery trucks onto quiet and clean e-cargo bikes. That's another type of micromobility, if we mention this, Matt. And imagine what type of impact it will have on our urban life quality and on our health and wellness and happiness. And studies all over the world that try to find a theme within the cities that have either made it or are struggling to found the agenda that starts basically with the local leadership, both elected and the professional one. And they decided they were courageous enough to put pedestrians first, cyclists come second, public transit comes third, and I always like to quote Enrique Peñalosa from the former mayor of Bogota, who said that under all constitutions and democracy, a bus carrying 100 passengers is eligible for 100 times more roads right of the road than a car carrying a single passenger. And of course, the urban freight, the last mile urban freight distribution. And it comes at the expense of somebody. I mean, we can't. The geometry of space is not infinite. So it comes at the expense of the queen of the past 120 years of the road. But it comes in order to make our really to free our urban space, to make it vibrant, to have our citizens happier and healthier, to allow our local businesses to flourish, because they are so important to the soul and the fabric of our cities, and of course have a vibrant and bustling public space based on diverse and balanced mixed use, alive and full of commotion, crowded with people and busy with pedestrian traffic, not with vehicular traffic. And it is active and accessible to all of all ages, and at any time, day or night, safe and pleasant. And of course, with the ever-growing climate change, let's try to make that is well shaded by wide canopy trees that also help us from the rain and from the winds. So we can go about to reach there either the long way or the shorter way, I would say. The long way is from this situation to this status, and most of you might recognize Amsterdam in the 70s and in the 21st century right now. It was a move that the Dutch people took them about 3 to 4 decades to complete. The other option, and we don't have that much time, is to arrive from this position where all the area is consumed by cars to this status. And this is from a place in Milano called Piazza Arcobaleno in just a matter of weeks. And yes, I'm talking about tactical urbanism, the ability to use the tool to run revolutions in our cities literally overnight, as it was defined by Mike Lydon, a short-time action for long-time change. And basically, with tactical urbanism, you can about to do anything from bike lanes to plazas and pop-up markets to parklet and much, much more. Traffic calming to increase safety, curb extension to square corners and allow better visibility and better safety for cyclists and pedestrians and to slow traffic. Think about tactical painting and art, adding color, visibility, and community involvement, civic engagement in the area. And of course, tactical bike lanes of all types and sorts, as long where the imagination goes. And mostly I like take a look at the one on the upper left, just separated by toilet plungers. I mean, there's no limit to the human spirit. And the COVID-19 and tactical urbanism are allowing us an opportunity of once in a lifetime, or if you'd like, once in a century, where basically hundreds of cities around the world are able to reclaim back space from cars for people. And the absence of cars during COVID-19 allowed city residents and city dwellers and leaders to see how much unfit our cars are for the urban fabric, for the core urban fabric, and how much space are they consuming, and just taking it back for bicycle infrastructure, for micromobility infrastructure, to use e-cargo bikes for deliveries instead of polluting vans, and to run, of course, streeters allowing outside dinner, really is an opportunity of once in a lifetime to change the balance and bring back the streets and the space for pedestrian, for cyclists, making cities for people, less of a cities for cars. Or as in the plan, the grand plan of Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, La Ville du Quart l'Or, which means every borough, every neighborhood will be self-sufficient and allowing the residents to self-fulfill all their amenities and needs and services, both commercial and municipal, within a 15-minute walk or ride without the need to be dependent on a car. And actually, this leads to us to the conclusion that our cities don't need cleaner cars, electric or autonomous. Our cities need fewer cars. And if we just take a look in the past of Amsterdam on the left or Copenhagen on the right, and just 40 or 50 years later, see how it is made, then we understand that this is possible and this is in our hand. And as Fred Ken said, and I'm just showing I'm finishing with the transformation on Times Square that was done initially by tactical urbanism, that if you plan a city for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. But if you plan a city for people and places, you get people and places. And just hop on the micromobility vehicle of your option, a bicycle, an e-bike, an e-cargo bike, or a scooter, leave your car at home, and help your city reach wherever they need, not really make the budget down. And as Walt Disney said, if we can dream it, we can make it. I thank you very much for inviting me over to speak, and I will be more than happy to participate and answer questions.
Eyal, thank you very much for your tour de force. That was excellent. Thank you very much for a great introduction. So I'm just going to line up the next set of slides and then introduce our next speaker. So if we can just introduce Steve. Let me just stop that. Our next speaker does not have any slides, so bear with me. Our next speaker is Alan Benson, who is the chair of Transport for All. So Alan, if I can just invite you to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I thought you'd missed me there. So I am a transport geek and campaigner. I'm afraid I'm one of those influencers that you hear so much about these days. I'm also a wheelchair user, and as Matthew said, chair of Transport for All, which is a London-based charity campaigning for the rights of disabled people to travel independently. I've got, in the next 5 minutes or so, just a bit of a stream of consciousness for you, but essentially it's some bad news, some good news, and then 3 lessons that I think I hope I can get you to take away and contemplate. So firstly, the bad news, and that's really that micromobility in the UK, scooters, bikes, rental bikes, they're seen a bit as the spawn of the devil by the disability community. This is based on current trials around the world, current implementations around the world, and very much along the dockless bikes that have been rolled out in the UK. Frankly, if you're not aware of the problems, then you're not paying attention. It comes from these micromobility devices being driven on the pavements, from careless parking. I mean, I've had a very nasty experience where there was a bike parked over a dropped curb. So I couldn't get back onto the pavement. So I ended up having to wheel down a dual carriageway with double-decker buses and very large lorries. And that's a deeply unpleasant experience. So these are seen very much as an obstacle for blind and partially sighted people, but they do also cause problems for chair users like me, for people who are neurodiverse, and for older people, parents. They do have quite a few issues, shall we say. That's the bad news. There is some good news, though. The good news is disabled people are also your customers. They're also users, potentially, of these devices. So in the UK, 20%, so that's 1 in 5 of the population, is disabled. That's a spending power of about £249 billion a year. So they're a really good market if you embrace them. We are developing solutions to a lot of these problems that I've raised. Things like more accurate geofencing to prevent pavement riding. And of course, I do believe that it's a bit of a King Canute issue. Micromobility is coming. E-scooters are coming. Bikes are coming. The hoverboards are coming. So it's an opportunity that we've got to grasp. But the question really is, how do we go about doing that? So I guess the first of my lessons that I want you to take away is that it's the journey, it's the thing. People don't want to hire bikes or scooters, use scooters in and of themselves. It's all part of wanting to get from A to B conveniently. Now, we all know that cars are really convenient, but parking is a real problem. So micromobility, coupled with public transport, that's a real opportunity to get this right. And these journeys, they can be, certainly they can benefit from the inclusion of scooters and bikes and e-bikes. But if these things are left carelessly on the pavement, if they're in people's way, if they're obstacles, then they become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So it's really important to get the PR right. And we need to get that right, not just for the riders, so we set expectations of behaviour, but also for the public. So we need to communicate the benefits. We need to communicate what's been done to encourage good behaviour, or indeed enforce good behaviour. I talked earlier about the objections that are coming out of the disability community. We need to really tackle those head on and provide answers and address them. My second lesson is really that there are no there's nothing new here. There are no new ideas, just recycled old ones. And we need to look at what's gone on in the past, what's gone in the past in other parts of the world, in other technologies, and look at what works and what doesn't work. And then if we go back 100 years, look at when cars were first introduced, the idea of a person walking in front of the car, waving a red flag, we look upon that now as just a ridiculous idea. But we've come a long way since then, and we've had some successes. So drink driving, for example, is now, there are technological solutions to that in terms of the breath machines in cars, but also it's socially unacceptable for drink driving. And it's that kind of attitude that we need to instill in the micro mobility arena. And we need to accept that people's concerns are real and they are valid. And where technical solutions exist, implement them, but also change attitudes. My third lesson, my final lesson, is play to our strengths. So micromobility is a much more dynamic, much more flexible and responsive, and to a certain extent more cash-rich technology than looking at the old transport leviathans. You know, if you look at train companies, bus companies, it can take many, many months, even years, to come up with solutions. With micromobility, with e-scooters, e-bikes, the dynamic companies behind these, we really need to be much more responsive and much more rapid in our responses. The other thing that I would really say is that we need to consult. And it's important there to understand the difference between user forums, and particularly forums of disabled people with lived experience. They are perfectly valid ways of gathering intelligence, gathering information. But there's a difference between user forums and actual experts. And there's the old analogy of pay peanuts, get monkeys. But it does stand up to some scrutiny. We really need to identify the people who really understand the problems and can look forward to the solutions, and engage with those professionals. So really, and I've not gone into detail because I think there's a lot of crossover between consulting and engaging with the general public and the disability community, even if the disability community is much more vocal. But I think it's all about recognizing that disabled people are an opportunity to build better solutions. And I think that's what we're all after. Thank you for your time. And as has been said, I look forward to answering any questions that you've got.
Thanks very much, Alan. That was excellent. Again, I particularly like your point about taking good regard to the past, I know when bicycles were first introduced, they were seen as dangerous, and we moved from the penny farthing through the safety bike, and it became part of the urban form. So perhaps looking back is indeed what we should be doing as well as forward. Thanks very much. I'm now going to move forward to our next speaker, which I'd like to introduce. We're moving from the UK across to Portland, Oregon, where it's currently 7:30 in the morning. So I hope Steve's had his breakfast cereal, got him and a cup of coffee. Steve Hoyt Macbeth is the Active Transportation and Safety Division Manager for Portland Bureau of Transportation. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and it's just great to be at Como UK. I've had the pleasure of having a couple of Como UK staff at sessions that I was participating in as a watcher of those. So it's great after I've learned so much from Antonia Roberts and Chris Slade, who I know used to be with Como UK, who spoke at our conferences for the North American Bike Share Association in Oregon. And thanks, Matt, for that promotion. I'm actually a section manager, not a division manager, but I'll let my boss know after this presentation that I've ascended to her position. So I'm gonna be speaking with two perspectives today. One, as with my city bureaucrat hat on at the City of Portland as the program manager for our bike share program, Bike Town. And also I was involved in the project team for our first e-scooter pilot in 2018, which we've continued on now for a second pilot. And also as the past president for kind of Como UK's kind of sister organization in North America, NAPS, the North American Bike Share Association, which is the trade association for shared micromobility. And so, so I'm really excited to talk to you about both of these things. And so I'd like to start, what I wanted to say, was that I'm going to be pulling really what I have to say from two reports that I've had the pleasure to be a part of. One is the State of the Industry report that NABSA, the North American Bike Share Association, put out earlier this year that we're incredibly proud of. We used tool design and University of California at Berkeley to kind of develop that report. And it's just really filled with data from a lot of different sources. And then our both 2018 and 2019 e-scooter findings report, where we pulled from a lot of sources of data to put it together. And so kind of broad brush in terms of within North America right now, we have developed a really impressive footprint in terms of both of the number of vehicles that we have in North America in terms of both scooters and bike share and the number of trips. And, so we're just at about 200,000 vehicles now in North America. About 90% of those vehicles are in cities in the United States, and over 150 million trips. And I think that what is really astounding to me is that in 3 years, e-scooters have just exploded, and more than half of all the vehicles and all the trips in North America are being made by shared e-scooters, which is just a absolutely phenomenal growth that we've seen, and I think is really exciting. And I hope that as I speak, I can also kind of speak to my fellow bike share colleagues who may be listening, and maybe some of the trepidation that they're feeling with this new kind of competitor coming into the market or having already come into the market. And I think that what we're seeing in the United States and in Canada and Mexico is that both of these modes are doing a good job of shifting people from car trips and from Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing services to a much more carbon light form of micromobility. And what I do want to point out, so we have if you look at both single occupancy vehicles and ride sharing, that we're seeing a really large number of trips shifting to micromobility. And the numbers actually look even better on the shared e-scooter side. And frankly, the numbers from our user surveys that we have conducted in Portland are even stronger than this. So it's 29% of a mode shift for bike share and 41 within the continent for e-scooter share. And I think that, we were one of the first cities that actually had done one of these surveys. And I remember when we saw the data and sharing it with some of our e-scooter providers, and we were all really, I was frankly a bit dumbfounded. And I think that what we've really seen from the user data that we've done in the user surveys is that a big reason this is happening is because e-scooters have been, frankly, more successful than at least we've been in Portland over the last 40 years, just kind of busting our chops trying to get people onto micromobility. And in our case, most of that time has been to bring them to bicycles. And what we saw with e-scooters is just this ability of this new form factor to really bring new people in that we were not successful in bringing. And it really came through in the user survey, where like over 3/4 of the people had used scooters had never used bike share, and 40% of them never biked. And I think that that's really, in my view, why we're seeing such a bigger pull of these e-scooter trips from single occupancy vehicles and from Uber and Lyft and taxis, is because they're really doing a great job of bringing in a new market of people to shared micromobility. And I think that the great thing from the bike share's point of view, and especially for systems that have electric assist bicycles, is the form factor of e-scooters is really good for some trips, but it's really not good for others. It's not a great trip to do if you're going to be getting a good load of groceries, or if you're going to be on a road. Unfortunately, a lot of the roads in Portland aren't without potholes, and so like the e-bike can kind of like provide, or just a pedal-only bike can provide a lot more kind of use cases that we can't with a scooter. So I think there's a real complementary nature to the two modes. I will acknowledge that we saw with e-scooters coming in a real hit with our bike share system in terms of those tourist trips and kind of some of those juicy from a revenue perspective trips that e-scooters really grabbed a lot of those. And the other piece of this puzzle is that, like, and I know that some cities that have already in the UK had some e-scooters and that there are a lot of pilots coming. We saw just a real incredible reaction from the public, both an incredibly positive reaction, and then a lot of people who are really upset. And then when we looked at the user survey, we actually conducted a public opinion survey and saw actually a pretty high level of approval from the general public in scooters. For scooters, that was actually much higher among our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our low-income populations, and our renter populations, and they were the least popular among our senior populations. And then, so I want to just kind of go from there to just kind of my last slide, which is really just from our experience in North America, and especially from Portland, what we found really worked really well. And I would encourage any cities on the call or local government folks to kind of at least consider this if you haven't already. One is just to require in-app education about the rules and good behavior on e-scooters. In our survey, we asked people, we quizzed them on the rules, and we also asked them how they learned about them. And we spent a lot of money on doing kind of public messaging campaigns. What was most successful by far, over 60% of the people that learned about the rules and knew them found it from in-app education that happened within the e-scooter app. And I really appreciated Alan's comments, which I think are spot on. We really found that the key to success was really engaging early with disability and pedestrian activists, and make sure that they're at the table when you're designing it. And we kind of failed on that first piece of having them at the table on the first round, and came back and really spent a lot of time with the community and the leadership talking about how we could make the pilot better. Thirdly is I really would encourage, and I think this is beneficial to the e-scooter companies as well, to have a requirement that a city design survey needs to be sent out to users that actually comes back to the city in terms of controlling that survey. That gave great data and actually, I think, really boosted the case for e-scooters. And then if you have budget, we spent about $15,000 in an independent public opinion poll, which again really helped us because people who didn't like scooters were very loud and really were calling our local government officials. I would strongly encourage you to incorporate equity goals into your permit. We required a portion of all scooters to be deployed in our low income and parts of our community that have higher concentrations of people of color and Black and Indigenous populations. If you can designate space for parking for e-scooters, that's been our biggest complaint that we continue to see from pedestrians and from the general public is scooters not having a place to park or just being parked in a way that are blocking pedestrian access. And what I forgot to put here, which was just a complete oversight of mine, is requiring data sharing. So in the US and in Canada, we use the mobility data feed specification as well as GBFS. I know in Europe that MDS really doesn't fit with the privacy kind of constraints and rights that are there. So I really would encourage you to have that GBF presentation. And so with that, I will end my presentation and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Steve. That's been very insightful. I'm sure that people who are implementing pilots in the UK will find some of those that on-ground experience really useful. So next, I'm going to move on to another Steve, back in the UK this time, Steve Pyre, who is country manager for Spin. So Steve, welcome to Como UK, and over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's getting late, I guess, on a Thursday afternoon. So appreciate everyone being here. Just need to operate properly. Matt's taken me through this several times on how I operate the slides, and I've already pressed the cursor button on my laptop and done it by mistake. So first of all, I work for a company called Spin. We're Ford owned, which is, I think, we're the only micromobility company at the moment that aren't VC backed. But previous life, I spent 10 years in micromobility, predominantly on bikes, starting off and cutting my teeth on the London Cycle Hire scheme and going through many different iterations since then. So I've been around for quite a while. What I like about this company is, as you'd expect from a Ford-owned company, we put safety first, and that's forefront of everything we do. And that's for the user and the non-user as well. So we have a responsibility to pedestrians, we have a responsibility to other road users, and people getting on our scooters should expect that when they do, it's going to work and it's safe as they do so. We've only ever launched with permission. We're 4 years into our life now. We started in 2016 in San Francisco. And every time we've done it, we've launched with permission with the city every time. We've only ever scaled responsibility, and we share the data, which is really valuable to cities to see exactly where people are going, what sort of demographics are using them. So I'm going to focus really this next 9 minutes or so on sort of the parking options you can get with micromobility, and then a little bit on the sort of funding ideas, where money can come from to get these things up and running. So, I mean, there's a few different types of parking. There's the completely flexible, which is free floating, very, very strict, hub-based, or there's a mixed kind of model that you can use as well. And some of these areas here, you can see in the middle, the P's parking areas, are sort of areas that you would specifically want to put micromobility. Transit nodes around train stations. I think you would probably very likely do a lot stricter parking around those areas because they can get very busy with people coming in and leaving. And also on the micromobility scooters, that is, but also a lot of footfall around the area. So you want to sort of keep those quite tight. I think if you go into the outer areas of a city where there's a lot more space, you might want to use a bit more free floating. So it really does depend on your geography. And a very big generalization here is that cities prefer strict parking because it brings a lot more control and certainty about where the fleet's going to be. Users prefer free floating. If you've ever used a dock-based bike share system, for example, if you get to a dock and it's full, then got to spend time trying to find where the next one is. So that creates inconvenience and a poorer user experience. As Alan has already pointed out as well, very well, bad parking behaviours can cause issues for many people, whether that's disabled or wheelchair users, pushchairs, buggies. So we need to be really cognizant of everybody here, not just people using the scheme. Parking hubs. So these can come in many shapes and forms, and we've got a lot of experience in those. So the very basic one you see here is some vinyl or some painting on the ground. And these are geo-fenced, so a user cannot lock the scooter or the bike outside of this geo-fenced area. And there's carrot and stick approaches, so we can give credits to people that park very well and correctly, and you can also put, I guess, fines, but you can charge people extra if they try and park it outside of these areas, because your operation's going to have to sort of go and get them and spend a bit more time doing it. So this brings a nice, neat, orderly part to the city. And if you look at some areas of some cities, that they are very, very tight anyway, and there is a bit of a bun fight for street space. So having specific designated parking hubs does bring a lot of convenience. And there are charging stations as well. So you've seen it with the Boris bikes, you've seen it with e-bikes out there now where they charge. Spin have got charging hubs and stations. So this also brings several benefits. I guess from the operations perspective, you know, the scooters are always going to be charged, and from a customer's perspective, they're going to be charged. Plus, docking stations do bring a bit more security. So you do know that the asset's going to be protected and looked after a little bit more. But I mean, there are difficulties with this. It takes a lot more time to put them in the space. You do need a lot of space to put hubs in, and you do need to connect them to the LV network. So there is time, cost, and quite often planning permissions that you need to consider when you do this as well. This is just one example that here's one we've done earlier. This is some work we've done down in Lewisham. We've worked with a company called YesMake, and I really liked your term tactical urbanism. So this is a parklet that we've created, say in conjunction with YesMake. We do this all over the US in the cities we work in. They can be bike parking stations, scooter parking stations. As yet, this one is just a nice social community place where a focal point in the area. And we've had some really positive feedback from the residents and also businesses nearby, because people generally will go and buy something from the businesses and then mingle and stay close by. So this has taken up 9 car parking spaces, but it's created a much wider footway in a time where people want to social distance and a place where people can actually move and get around. So we directly impact the cities we do. And I think all micromobility operators should design this kind of thing into their systems. It works really well. And you do need a community involvement in everything you do. A few points on funding. So funding comes from several different sources, and you're going to need to consider how you would like to do this. Generally, what we're seeing with the e-scooter trials at the moment in the UK specifically is that it's all privately owned, privately put out there, and all the risk is on the private company. But private revenue comes in from sponsors, for example, or advertising. So you've got Santander in London, JC do their advertising model. So they'll put bikes in, but you hand over advertising space in the city. So there's lots of revenue can come in from that way. Publicly funded. So some cities do fund this themselves, like any public transport system. It's subsidized. So it's completely paid for by the public transport authority or the city. And then obviously some of the funding sources you get is revenue from users. So I guess the more privately owned they are and the more risk the private sector put in, the more expensive they will be for the user. The more public subsidy that goes into it, the more subsidies you can have. So it's a reduced fee for the user as well. And really that's the end of my little section here. There is a Q&A session at the end, and as everyone else has said, I'd happily take some questions, so please do. Just one thing I'd like to sort of put in your mind really is if you had a scooter company coming into your city, what sort of engagement would you like? What would you expect to see from that provider? It'd be really good to get some of your thoughts on that. So I'll hand back to Matt. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. And if people are wondering, Steve was sitting in a camper van. So last but not least, I'd like to hand over to Councillor Anna Richardson, who is city convener for sustainability and carbon reduction at Glasgow City Council. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And today I'm just going to give a very brief rundown of Glasgow's bike share scheme, and I'm also going to talk about how we've had to adapt to COVID. I'll also touch on some other walking and cycling improvements that we've got going on in the city at the moment and how they link to bike share. So for those who aren't familiar with our city's bike share scheme, we launched in partnership with Nextbike in 2014. And then we entered a second contract with Nextbike in 2017. Our target then was 100 stations and 1,000 bikes by 2025. But now we're already at 79 stations and 800 bikes, well ahead of schedule. As well as the planned expansion, we've also sought additional external funding, which has allowed us to make faster progress than we'd initially planned. And we've got a fleet of e-bikes as part of the scheme too, which have proved very popular, and we have plenty of hills here in Glasgow to try them out as well. We launched the first 63 bikes just a year ago, and we're expanding further this autumn with an additional 20 bikes joining the fleet. And despite all this progress so far, we still know that we need to move faster. There is a constant demand for new stations from various communities. People are really keen for us to come to their neighbourhood next. And I think that's a good problem to have. It shows that our scheme is growing sustainably. And in June, we marked our millionth hire, and the scheme continues to grow. Of that million hires, half were in 2019 alone. And excitingly, Scottish Government funding that Glasgow received through Paths for All enabled us to put in place this offer over lockdown. We launched the free rides offer in July. All 30-minute journeys are free until March next year. And we think this is a great opportunity to provide low-cost transport and to mainstream bike share as a practical way to move around the city and hopefully creating new habits along the way. Because cycling has certainly shown itself over lockdown to be remarkably resilient as a mode of transport. We've seen more people out cycling across the city, and bike share data has shown the same trend. In July, we had a 22% increase in use on July 2019. This graph shows that this increase has remained consistent as we've moved into the autumn months. And given that here in Glasgow and in Scotland, working from home and minimising unnecessary travel is still the prevailing message, these figures are all the more impressive. But bike share is not the only thing we've been doing to support cycling during the pandemic. Glasgow's been at the forefront of Scotland's work to create temporary measures that enable walking, cycling and wheeling during COVID. We received a total of £7.5 million of Scottish Government funding, and with that we're building pop-up cycle lanes, such as here. This is along Glasgow's Riverside. It's one of our busiest commuter routes, and the Riverside walkway simply was not coping with the number of people who were wanting to travel actively across it. So we've got around 30 kilometres already on the ground of this type of pop-up cycle lane, and we've got plenty more in the pipeline. We've also been expanding our school car-free zones. We had a pilot of 6 zones already underway, and as a result of the temporary measures, we've rolled out another 20 very, very quickly. We've done that to enable social distancing at the school gates where there's a lot of congestion, as well as to encourage people to leave the car behind and to walk, cycle, wheel or scoot to the school gate instead. And we're looking to roll out a third phase as quickly as possible because this is a really urgent issue that we need to tackle around our primary schools. And we've created some nice traffic-free space. This is Kelvin Way. It was usually a very busy road that cut in between the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum and one of the city's busiest parks. We've taken the traffic off of it and everybody around there is loving it. It's really changed the feel of the entire area. It's connected the green space to the museum and to the university behind. But it's also been very widely supported by the community, and I think this is very likely to become a permanent change as a result of our temporary measures. But we've got long-term ambitions as well, and they've not been put on hold. We are developing a new transport strategy and an active travel plan for Glasgow, which will ensure that our transport network responds to the climate emergency. As part of that, we'll also develop a plan for a comprehensive network of cycle lanes, because good infrastructure goes hand in hand with bike share. Both make cycling seem like an option that is for anyone, whether they have access to their own bike or not. With the majority of our residents living in flats and tenements, bike use without the trouble of bike storage can be a very appealing proposition. So we've added hire stations along new cycle lane projects. This is one that is currently in construction at the moment, since construction came back after lockdown. But this approach has had some drawbacks as well. It's meant that bike share follows the pattern of investment in cycle lanes, which in the past has focused more heavily in certain parts of the city. This is in the south side of Glasgow, and it's one of our flagship cycle lanes, and we have put Next Bike hire stations along the way. We're starting to change that as we begin more work in the east and the north of the city too, but it is going to take time for that to bed in. But the great thing about our COVID-related pop-up lanes is that it's given us an opportunity to redress this balance with very quick to implement lanes. This is in the northeast of the city. It's a temporary measure and it's an area with very little existing infrastructure. It would take time to build a network here, but we're able to roll this out very quickly. We'll also need to find new ways to rapidly expand the Next Bike network across the city, especially if we're serious about tackling transport inequality at the same time as the climate emergency. So that's just a very, very brief overview of the current work that's happening in Glasgow. I'm very optimistic that throughout this terrible crisis, we have had a chance to accelerate our move towards sustainable transport and to bring bike share to a wider audience. I'm really looking forward to answering questions later on in the session as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. And very interesting to see the growth in bike share over the summer there. Some analysis I've been doing on the London cycle hire scheme has shown a very similar trend. And actually what's really interesting when you dig into it is that not only were there more bike share trips, but the trips were longer as well, albeit they were mainly for leisure purposes rather than the commuting that they were. So I would like to invite everybody back to the stage. So if you can, those of you who got working cameras up, that would be great. And there's a series of questions that I'd like to go through. So I'm going to start with thinking about the form factor. So we've heard about bikes, we've heard about e-scooters, and we know that the future is evolving. Some of us have seen it happening in front of our eyes, Steve and Eyal in both Portland and Tel Aviv. So can I ask a question, which is, should we be prioritizing active travel versus non-car modes? So effectively, should we be promoting for things where people are actively moving? Does that matter? How do e-scooters fit into this? So effectively, is it small vehicles or is it active vehicles that we're promoting? Anyone like to start me on that one?
Go ahead, Steve. I'll answer after you.
Okay, sure.
We've got two Steves. We'll have Steve. Steve,
yeah, which Steve do you want? Maybe I'll give us.
I think Steve 1 is Portland. Steve 2 is Pyre.
Like an American, I can't shut up. I would just say I would prefer a focus on just on shared micromobility, because I think that if we take a broader approach to that, we bring more people to the table. And if I think a lot of us are really motivated by climate as well as creating great cities, and if we limit ourselves to just one, then I think we really kind of narrow that door. And I think that what we find is that if people come to it from one mode, they actually will kind of stay and try out the other mode as well.
It's very interesting.
If I might add to that,
Sure.
Well, on a personal note, I'm an avid cyclist for both sport and transport. So on a personal note, I would prefer active mode, which means where you have to pedal and brake sweat a little bit. But I do agree with Steve that I mean, any person that we get off a car onto bicycle, e-bike, or a scooter, that's a blessing for the cities and for the communities. So I'd go, I mean, in a way, if a city eventually down the line can make an incentives scheme that will somehow incentivize more active, that's fine, but anyone who joins the community is welcome.
Great. Would anybody else like to chip in on that one?
So I think, there's clearly an advantage, personally, in terms of health, to active transport. But I think if you just limit it to that, then you're being exclusive. You're excluding people who, for whatever reason, can't partake in that activity. And I think there are so many more benefits to micromobility over cars, in terms of space use, in terms of emissions, in terms of green energy. I think we need to encourage all micromobility, whether it's active or otherwise.
Thanks very much, Alan. Steve?
Well, Steve said earlier that they were surprised by the number of, or the different demographic that got on e-scooters. So I think the broader the options you have, the broader the demographic you get, and the more people you can take out of cars. So small and green and more variety is the way to go.
Right. Anna, you're at the point where you have bikes and you also have some e-bikes, but you don't yet have e-scooters. What do you think about this question?
I'm really keen to see people using anything that isn't the private car for their journeys, and I would echo a lot of what's been said already. I think there's something really powerful about people who think of themselves as multimodal. I think too often if you just have the car there, you're more likely to jump into it because that's how you always travel. And so having a variety of options available maybe makes people think about what's the most appropriate way to travel for this particular journey, rather than how do I travel as a person. I'm really keen to see e-bikes expand further because I think that makes cycling more inclusive. And in terms of e-scooters, we have, as a council, agreed to start a trial, or to look into a trial under the new guidance. But certainly that's going to take a while to to work through. And I think we do need to be very cautious about exactly how we implement that trial and to take all the learning that we need to from it. So I'm quite interested in where we go with e-scooters, but certainly as a city, we're going very cautiously towards that and hopefully learning from all the cities that have been there before. And that's why some of the presentations today have been hugely informative and really helpful for us.
I think what you've mentioned there is quite interesting. So in terms of being multimodal and labelling ourselves as things, so people are often labelled as cyclists. And the reality is that people aren't just cyclists, they walk, sometimes they don't go out, sometimes they might drive a car. With something like an e-scooter, we don't have a word for that. We don't have an e-scooterists, there isn't such a thing. So there isn't a label that we can readily put on people, which I think is probably a good thing and probably a thing that we should move away from. Can I just, following on from that question, think a little bit about whether these schemes are for everybody and for equity. It's interesting that Steve from Portland mentioned that actually e-scooters have been shown that there are different groups of people who are more interested in e-scooters than perhaps they were in bikes. I know, Anna, in Glasgow, there's been some work look not just the free rides, which I think is open to everybody, but also some programs of engagement. Would you like to say a little bit more about what's been going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And Como was one of the partner organisations that has done so much fantastic work in Glasgow, and it's a project called Bikes for All, and it was about ensuring that those from low-income households didn't have to pay the usual Next Bike subscription, but instead got a very, very, very reduced rate for that, and also got some engagement with local organisations that would encourage those people then to feel empowered enough to ride, for example, refugees, people who'd just come to the city, and they were able to get very cheap access to transport, but also to just feel part of the city. I think when you cycle or walk through a city, you start to become part of the fabric of it. So it really allowed people to explore the city differently, and that's been a project that's been very successful, and through evaluations have shown that it has reached those minority groups that perhaps wouldn't be seen in our usual cycling demographic. So it shows that when you bring in that targeted intervention and create that support around it as well, you can really get fantastic results.
Alan, I wonder if you had any thoughts on this topic.
Well, I was going to jump in and say one of the things that people often don't consider is that particularly cycles can be mobility aids. There's a great charity in London, Wheels for Wellbeing, who are trying very hard to promote different kinds of cycles in hire schemes. I'm thinking about tricycles. So you might have a tricycle to get you from your house to the station, but you often can't get them on the train. So it's particularly useful to be able to hire one of those at the other end of your journey. So it's not only about lower income groups, or it's also about trying to be creative with the different vehicles so that they're inclusive as well.
Thanks very much, Alan. Steve or Eyal, do you have experience from your cities of ways of trying to make these schemes more inclusive?
Eyal, I'll pass to you this time.
Thanks. Okay, I'll take the burden. Well, actually, yes. I mean, part of my job for the DOT is as the head for pilot projects is trying to bring schemes to include the more special, more unique populations into it, and of course we're talking here because of the ethnographic diversity in Israel. We're talking minorities such as the Muslim or the Christian population in Jaffa, the southern parts of Tel Aviv. We're talking about the ultra-Orthodox Jewish people who don't really ride. We have a lot of immigrants, refugees from Africa. So the different populations that we now want to bring in into expanding the volume of cycling, with the rate of cycling within them. And we're building that actually through schemes that work with what we've started with through community bike shops. We've started actually building community bike shops in different neighborhoods, both associated with the community centers and also street level shops that the city, the municipality has rented, where we open bicycle or cycling courses and also mechanic courses for youth people, for students, for disengaged youth, for young women and children. We mostly see the need to get more the gender this part of riding, because we have right now 30% ladies and 70% men, and we see the ladies, I think, all over the world. Wherever ladies are cycling, more women cycling is like the canaries in the mines, which is when they start riding, we know that the network is safe for them and for the children. So definitely we're putting an effort there to bring them through those special activities.
Great, thanks very much. Steve, anything from your side?
Yeah, I'll try to be really. I've got lots of points, but I'll try to be.
Sure.
One of them is what we saw in our first scooter pilot is that we required to have low-income options on the e-scooter side, and the performance of the companies in actually getting those door and into communities was very poor. I would say that we've pushed stronger in the second pilot, and I would just give a shout out to Steve and to Spin. And that one of the things that we did in a pilot with them was where we both put some skin in the game, where Spin committed to, in East Portland, which is a lower income area of our city, committed to reduced fares for a couple of months if we reduced the fees that they had to pay to the city. And that was a really successful partnership where we saw both the number of trips in East Portland increase and also the length of trips, which was kind of across the board that we have seen during COVID in the US, was really important. And I would say that the public ownership of that as well, we just can't kind of like, I think that there's a public, and when I say public, I mean government responsibility to kind of like do some of that work to make sure it happens. And then at least in the US, relationships are incredibly key, and actually spending the staff time and having outreach people both at the micromobility providers, but also at local government that are creating partnerships with communities to understand them is very, very key. And we've had our most success when we've done that. And the last thing I'll say is just what we've really heard from our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities is that the idea that riding a bicycle outside of traffic safety is a safe activity is a really kind of white supremacist idea. And it really gets away from the fact that being in public space for Black and Indigenous people in our country is an unsafe experience, where they're much more likely to be racially harassed, more likely to be racially profiled by our police. And so I think we really need to have an appreciation when we talk about safety, not just about traffic safety, but like just actually safety in public space, and how there's a real racial justice element to that.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to go to some questions coming through from the audience now. Oh, sorry, Alan.
Just before we leave that, I'd like to throw one quick thought. Under the Equality Act 2010, there is a public sector equality duty that local authorities have for implementing any infrastructures like bike lanes or these schemes. So they have to do an assessment of what impact it's going to have, both positive and negative. And I see no reason why that principle couldn't be applied by the micro-mobility companies when they actually look at their schemes, and to get some professionals in, look at what the true impact is, and as Steve says, look at perhaps the slightly different, unexpected angles of how the police might react to bike shares and that kind of thing. It's just a practical option for how you can tackle the equality impacts.
Thanks very much. I think that's interesting. I think quite a bit of this is related to who is paying for some of this infrastructure and who has control of it. And so I'm going to go to a question from the audience, from Wes. So, and the question is, in the opinion of the panel, who do you think should pay for charging and docking stations? Is it the towns and cities, or is it the operators? And I'm going to extend that a little bit to cover the actual vehicles as well. So the scooters and the bikes, noting that not all of these have infrastructure on the streets. So each of you will have different experiences of this, but interested in in thoughts. And I might go to maybe go to Anna first, as a city that's had sort of some public investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. We have put some money in to get Nextbike going, and one of the things that really enables an expansion for us as well is Scottish Government funding and other ways that we can get additional money in to really give that capital boost to get the stations in and to get the scheme expanding. But we're in a good position with Nextbike, and it cost the city very little money, relatively speaking, to run that scheme, given how quickly it's grown. And I think the sustainable growth of it is the bit that's really essential, because they need to be sure that they're putting bikes in that will be used, that will pay their way. So I think one of the key things there is working really closely together, and we have put a lot of energy and time and work into making sure that the stations are in the right places, that we're aligning them to other investment we make. So as I said, when we build a segregated lane, we ensure that docking stations go in intermittently along that. And I think it's that joined up approach that having the local authority really managing and being strategic about what transport outcomes we're looking for here is important, because that's actually going to mean that the scheme's more likely to be successful, and then those hires will be coming in and helping to pay back the money that's obviously going in from the private side of things. So I think we've got a model that works well. It has been successful so far.
Great, thanks very much. Would others like to comment on where the funding should sit?
I'll wear my city hat and say that in the city of Portland, we have a few fees that the e-scooter companies pay that help to fund the administration of that program. We have not actually required them to create parking spaces on the e-scooter side of things. Our bike share provider, as part of that system, it has actually provides the parking infrastructure for the new stations. We have legacy city-owned equipment. But I think that there's a couple things to say here. One is that there's the space in terms of creating a designated space, which I think is really important, and especially a lot of the UK cities are denser than what we have here in the US. Mm-hmm. And secondly, there's also just thinking about requiring, like, how, what is required. It's a big topic right now in the US and Canada about requiring Lock 2. So San Francisco, Chicago, I think there's another city I'm just forgetting, require the scooters actually to be able to lock to something, which on the local government side, they all are really have religion about that, because they feel like it's really helped with the pedestrian kind of access issues that have happened. And I think from the provider side, they have a different opinion on that.
I might go to, I know I can see that Steve Pyre is having some connection issues, so I'll just let his connection settle down. I might go to EL in terms of Tel Aviv. What's your approach been there in terms of public funding versus private funding?
Okay, I'll start by saying that I think that in terms of micromobility and especially e-scooters, probably Tel Aviv is the most regulated city among the cities where operators are operating. All of them are carrying, it's not license plate, but actually registration plate, so that they can be managed and traced, etc. And looking about the upcoming infrastructure, the talks that have been running in the DOT corridors are that the cost of putting them, of building and installing, will be a public or public-private partnership, and the charging itself will be borne by whomever uses, whether it's shared scooters or individuals who are in the public domain are charging their scooters. Then there will be some fees that down the line will cover the installing costs.
So effectively, you're saying that Tel Aviv is one of the most heavily regulated locations in terms of the connection between public and private. Steve Pyre, do you have, I know with your historic association with various different forms of micromobility, do you have either a spin view or a personal view on where funding should sit?
Personal view, I mean, it depends, but I think cities should get heavily involved in the funding. I think that in the same way that you would for any public transport system, because that reduces the burden on the end user as well. So if it is just a private company, there's lots of costs, lots of risks they have to do, and they have to recoup that somehow, whether it's through advertising, sponsorship, or revenue. But if you look at London Cycle Hire, for example, £2 for 30-minute journey. In fact, that's £2 all day, and every journey under 30 minutes is no charge. And in 10 years of using it, I've only ever gone over that 30 minutes once, and I was so angry with myself. I'm just a bit tight. So I think it's but you always will get the city involved, whether they put a financial commitment into it. It's really important to get like town planners. They know their city better than anyone. To get involved in working out where you put your equity programs, where you put your locations for docking stations. You can think off the top of your head of the simple, obvious ones, but everyone knows the nuances of their own city. So yeah, I think I prefer it to be micromobility should come under a multimodal transport system and be subsidised by the city if possible.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question now. This is from Ian Farquharson. So he's made the comment that the schemes that we've been talking about are very city centre orientated, and many of the journeys we're trying to eliminate, so those kind of shorter car trips, are often from the outskirts of cities and urban areas. So I wondered if anyone on the panel has any experience of micromobility schemes that aren't just city centre focused, that maybe reach out into suburbs a little bit more.
I'm happy to come in
sure,
in terms of with Next Bike, we have we started from the centre and did essentially a spider's web of going out the way, and we are starting to reach more suburban areas, and certainly over lockdown we've had a reduction in people travelling in and out of the city centre. Our city centre does not look like it ever has before, and yet there are still increased hires, which suggests that other journeys are being done, both on the bike share, but presumably that's also happening with people's personal bikes, etc. as well. So there's certainly a sense there that bringing these schemes out the way is really important, and certainly most of the requests we get for more docking stations is within people's residential neighbourhoods, and especially those that are more cut off because they're perhaps in less affluent areas. They don't have suburban rail, they don't have as many options as maybe other parts of the city do. And I think that's a really big opportunity. As you said, those are the journeys the car journeys that need knocked in their head. They're the ones that bus and rail perhaps won't tackle as easily because there just simply isn't the density of travellers. So if we can get out into those communities and then have people thinking about those neighbourhood style journeys on bike, scooter, etc. I think that's a real opportunity, rather than focusing always on the commuter journeys, the classic ones that transport planners always think about first, I think.
I think that's interesting, and I know that years of transport planning shows that going from centre to outskirts by public transport is typically easier than going around the outskirts. Often many of the public transport links are in and out of the centre rather than going around. Do other people have an experience of micromobility, shared bikes, e-scooters outside of the densest centres?
So I was going to share a very personal experience, but I think it's one that's shared by a lot of disabled people. In town centres, you tend to be wary of obstructions, be that advertising boards, be that dining experiences out on pavements, litter bins. You tend to be less cautious of them in suburban areas, and my experience of cycles just being left is that they tend to get left around significant points, so around bus stops. I went to post a letter today, couldn't get to the letterbox because there was a bike parked in the way. So I think the issues are the same in suburban areas. They're perhaps not quite so frequent, but they're much more unexpected. So the impact tends to be greater. But that's only a That's only my anecdotal experience.
No, it's very interesting. Would others like to comment on that?
Well, I can add my 2 cents worth of wisdom that I think that first of all, we had 4 operators in Tel Aviv, and that's Wind, Lime, and Bird, and there was a 4th one which was a local Israeli partnership, Leo, and they have decided to drop Tel Aviv like a year ago and move down to the Red Sea resort of Eilat, which is like 550 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. And this is the only city where they operate in. Now, it's a small city, like 30,000 residents, and it's a tourism resort, which naturally now with COVID and everything was dead for a few months. But they seem to still survive there. So I guess, yeah, I mean, you have to weigh the consequences, but I guess as there is a justification for sharing schemes, also not in the dense urban core, but they have to be considered a little bit differently.
I think that's interesting. I think that some snippets we're getting on usage of these services now is that they're being used a lot, but it's not necessarily for the traditional last mile to the railway station commuter type trips that we expected these schemes to be used for. I think that the way we're traveling is just a little bit different now. I'm going to move on to a question now from Lorna Stevenson, which is thinking about how micromobility can reduce car use, and really thinking about public space and how we use public space. So she's asking, how do we nudge the conversation towards finding space for micromobility by taking it away from cars rather than taking it away from pedestrians? So that kind of fits neatly with a question I have, which is thinking about parking. So parking is very important. Alan has talked about how having bikes and e-scooters parked in the wrong places is difficult. I wondered if people had thoughts about the ways to work with cities to encourage parking to be taking away from cars, so on the carriageway, rather than necessarily taking away from pedestrians on the pedestrian parts of the street. And interested from all comers on that one, and I think that there may be some different circumstances, maybe in Portland and Tel Aviv, depending on your urban form. But who'd like to start with that one?
I'm happy to jump in there a little bit. So I think firstly, I don't want to say this is a battle between cars and pedestrians or cars and bikes. I think there's too many of those conversations saying cars are evil. I actually think cars are really important in certain areas. But fewer cars are clearly, I think we can't sustain the number of cars we've got. I don't see it as taking away space from cars. I see it more as a rebalancing of the system. So cars have such a disproportionate space in our cities, but actually giving some towards micromobility, towards pedestrians, is just equaling up where we've been going far the other way. So I think we do need to do that. I think it's quite important for the space, especially social distancing right now. And it's also really important for air quality in cities.
Right, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I think what we found in Portland is that having better infrastructure benefits everyone, especially people on the more human scale side of transportation. We recently, between our first e-scooter pilot and our current one, we added a protected bike lane in East Portland, and kind of one of our lower income communities. We saw a ridership of e-scooters on that route increase by 150%, just a dramatic increase. And then in our e-scooter survey in general, we did observations at the staff level to see how well e-scooter riders were doing in terms of riding, not riding on the sidewalk, which is illegal in Oregon, in the state that Portland's within. And the better the facility, the more likely the scooters were to be riding in the facility. So it really creating, I think back to both what Matthew, you said, and to what the audience member had said, when we create more space, we see better behavior and we see less conflict.
Anna, I think in Glasgow, with the existing bike share scheme, quite a lot of the parking locations are on the pavement. Is that right, rather than on the road?
Yeah, but we're very careful about where we put them and make sure that
Sure.
there's plenty of space. But certainly, I think to echo some of the comments that have been made, we just need to look at the amount of space we have in our cities. Whether we like a particular mode of transport or not, we're not there to have those opinions. We're there to move as many people as efficiently as possible, and therefore the least efficient modes are currently taking up far too much space, to the detriment of others. I really like the comment that you just made there about if we have more space, then there will be far less conflict. I think it is ridiculous. We find ourselves in cities arguing about if there's enough space for bikes, scooters, people who are walking, and people who are in wheelchairs and everything else, because the vast majority of that space is being used as carriageway. I think we need to make sure that we're allocating enough space to all of those different uses, and that does mean that we have to cut into the carriageway that's used for private cars particularly. It's just a matter of geometry and a matter of how much land mass we have. You can't change where the buildings are. The streets are the width they are, and we need to use that space as efficiently as possible.
It's interesting, if you look at old pictures of, I happen to live on a Victorian terrace street, and it looks quite tight with lots of cars parked outside. You see a street when it was built, it looks quite wide, because actually there wasn't a distinction between the carriageway where you walk and where you park. It was just one level. So yes, maybe we can reimagine. And some of the stuff that we've seen from Tel Aviv in the first presentation, Eyal, is certainly about thinking about that space a bit more creatively, rather than just assuming what we have is what we should always have.
Yeah,
I think it's very important to set the expectations of the various users. I really liked the Tel Aviv presentation, and actually setting up the environment to support the more micro mobility, the more pedestrianised usage. But I think one of the things that disabled people regularly comment on is the reputation that Amsterdam and the Netherlands has got for being a very collaborative space with lots of shared space, and that's terrifying for us as disabled people. Those spaces don't feel safe. We do actually need clearly defined areas, particularly for blind and partially sighted people and people that can't make eye contact. So it's important to design the areas well.
I think that's a really important point. Thank you, Alan. I'm going to throw in another question now. I'm actually going to combine two questions using my chair's prerogative. One is from Robert Chopin from Co-Wheels, and the other is from Giles. And this is to do with integration between micromobility and other shared mobility modes in public transport. So thinking about car sharing, buses and trains. How do we join these up to tempt people out of cars? And the add-on part of this question is data and sharing of data about these modes part of this? Who's going to hit me with who's solved the data integration? Who's got some sort of integration that means you just come out of your house and all the modes are available, they're all being paid for with one mode, and it's all working perfectly? Or who would like that?
Well, I can try. I can try to talk about Startup Nation, but as you know, the sons of the shoemaker always walk barefoot. So there's a lot of trial going on here, and definitely there's a lot of activity in the space here. I think that while working with platforms such as Populous and Ride Report and others, trying to actually accommodate to MDS, basically we've come out now with the first city active or interactive map that allows both cycling routes and also put on it bike shares and scooter locations. But it is still in pilot in very early stages, so it would take time before it will lift off and really be fully implemented in commercial. But the trials are there. As for integrating with other modes of transportation, such as public transit, I think at least here we're still very much in infancy, because public transit, first of all, public transit suffers all over the world from like unbelievable suffering because of COVID. Specifically in Israel, we have to work on improving public transit, so we're not there yet on combining or integrating micromobility and public transit, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more on this topic, and then I'm going to ask you your last question. So, who'd like to chip in on integration? Who can either see it happening or has got the a particular view?
I think it's very interesting. We look at car applications. We look at routing, and they take account of busy junctions, traffic congestion. I noticed this week that the transport provider in London, TfL, has just started producing data on service capacity and where is busy and where isn't busy. As a wheelchair user, it's particularly important to me to know how busy services are. So I think there's huge, I can't get on a full train because my chair is just too big. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for providing through apps usage data for public transport, usage data for availability data for micro-mobility vehicles. So I think we're a little way away, but I think it would be a really good thing to have and would encourage people's use if they knew before they left their house what was available. So I don't think it's there yet, but I would encourage it.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to round off the session now, and I have one final question that I'd like to ask to all of our speakers, and that is, what is your vision for urban micromobility for 2025? I originally said 2030 in my pre-questions, but I'm aligning with the session tomorrow, so if you knock 5 years off your answer, and not putting anyone on the spot, I'm going to go to Steve number 1 first, please.
I guess number 1 is by who spoke first. Sorry, I just want to make sure there's no value.
Yeah, you're one. Yeah.
I think for me in the States, we have a very just kind of big sigh of relief with what's happened at the presidential level. I know I'm not supposed to be political, but my God. I mean, I think that what we really hope for is, and I think this is both at the federal level and at the local level, that the vision, if we're really going to have transformation in our transportation, the public sector really needs to step up. And financially, and I think that we'll the more that we come up, and I think what Anna shared with Glasgow in the first 30 minutes being free is incredibly inspiring to me. And so I think that, but the vision is more partnership, and partnership means putting money on the table, and that money is most likely to come from making it more difficult to drive an automobile, whether that be pricing schemes or additional parking fines.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to go to Eyal next.
Yeah, I would have commented to Steve that in 2025, still President Trump will be immobile. Unfortunately, might be but 2025 is the year that our strategic plan for Tel Aviv 25-25 is ending its first 5 years. We aim to reach a modal split of 25% by then, up from 11% now, which means by 2025, we anticipate that 25% of all human traffic, human movements in the city will be based on bicycle and micromobility, plus some 5,000 e-cargo bikes active in the city by then, about 2,000 for private use, and 3,000 like heavy-duty cargo bikes for commercial use. The city network, the network for cycling infrastructure, will grow from 130 to about 400 kilometers by then. In that regard, well, that's it. Sorry, that's the summary I see.
Thank you very much. Anna and your cat.
Yeah, this is Baby Innes. In terms of one of the most exciting themes I think that we've got coming forward over the next 5 and even 10 years is really focusing on our neighbourhoods and how we just turn those into places that people can live and relax and not have constant traffic. So what I'm really excited about is how we can use micromobility to tackle a lot of those journeys. We want walkable neighbourhoods that people can get around, but sometimes, you know, as people have said, you have to move goods or shopping. Sometimes you need to get across the neighbourhood in 5 minutes and not 15. So I'm really keen to see how micromobility can slot into no longer just city centres but our neighbourhoods, and doing that will make them accessible to a whole host of people that perhaps don't even use our city centres, because our lives are very much more surrounded by this sort of residential and local things that we need to do. So that's what I'm excited about.
That's great. Thanks very much. Steve.
Steve number 2, not second
Steve
best.
Number 2, yes. Yes, not at all.
Yeah, Steve number 1. So, I mean, only 5 years' time, that's not that far away in terms of some transport modes. In terms of micromobility, it's an age away. But, I mean, really, I'd like to see transport being a really simple option. So you talk about mobility on demand, you pay a fee, then you can use any transport mode you like. And then that will depend, you know, you can use an e-scooter for shorter journeys, for fun, for leisure, whatever. E-bikes, if you want to go a bit further, maybe you can have cargo bikes for transporting goods or your kids. But, you know, you turn up at a mobility hub and it's a simple choice depending on whatever your use case is that day. That would mean healthier, cleaner streets in terms of the air. People are more likely to get out and interact. And as Anna mentioned earlier, when people interact with their environment, like, you do soak up the streets, you do soak up the city, you do feel it a bit more. So I think people are happier. Personally, there's nothing I like more than cycling through the narrow streets of London and getting lost and going, oh, actually, this is really cool. That's kind of what I do. I'm a bit strange like that. So yeah, I think it just makes cities a nicer experience for people if you can do that.
Thanks very much, Steve. And last but not least, Alan.
So looking at 2030, I was looking at something along the Back to the Future hoverboards kind of technology, but that's sort of the geek in me. If we're looking at 2025, I think my hope is somewhat more practical. One of the things that I think we're missing at the moment is the ability to regulate, to manage. My understanding is that councils have no way to control antisocial behaviour. So I think in the short term, we've got some work to do on putting the right regulations in place so that we can manage behaviour. I think there's some work to be done by the companies themselves to put the technology in place to control rider behaviour as much as possible. I think we've got some work to do in educating the public, both in the benefits, the opportunities, as well as the expectations. And I think there's a real future for this if we get it right. And the next couple of years in the UK are going to be really key to that. And one of the key components is going to be consulting and engaging the right professionals to come up with the right answers.
Thank you very much, Alan. And indeed, thank you to all of our panelists today. I hope you've enjoyed listening and asking questions. I'm going to ask, first of all, say thank you to everybody. And what we're going to do is this has been Matthew Clark presenting from Steer. Thank you for joining us. Tomorrow there are 2 more sessions, starting at 10 o'clock, a session about employers and sustainable transport called Agents for Change. And then we're concluding the conference tomorrow at 2 p.m, where there'll be a session which is thinking about 2025 and where do we want to be by then. So I'd like to thank our participants, our sponsors, and thank you very much. Have a good evening. Don't forget, if you want to go to the cafe, I believe that will be open as well. Thanks very much.